All right, good morning. I have a brief opening statement. I want to welcome everyone to this very important hearing on the rights of indigenous peoples. The United Nations and the World Bank estimate that there are between 300 and 370 million indigenous peoples worldwide. They represent an important and irreplaceable piece of the world's cultural fabric, with unique ways of life, distinct identities, and many different economic, social, and political traditions. Today's hearing will focus on the indigenous peoples of Latin America. It is the first in a series of hearings the Human Rights Commission intends to hold over the coming months on the rights of indigenous peoples, which will look at the situation of indigenous peoples and tribal and ethnic minorities around the world. I want to thank Lars de Geer, who is a fellow at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, for coordinating today's hearing. I'd also like to express my appreciation to Hans Hogreffer, our staff director, Cindy Buell, my legislative director, and Ellen Lutz with Cultural Survival for helping us prepare for this hearing. There are also several individuals at the Office of the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples and at Amazon Watch, the Washington Office on Latin America, and the Center for International Policy, who were generous with their time and support for today's hearing. Now, growing up in the United States, I was aware from an early age that Native peoples have been gravely harmed and wronged over the centuries. It's an inescapable fact of our country. But I began to understand the situation of indigenous peoples in Latin America much later in life. In the 1980s, when I was a congressional aide with Congressman Joe Moakley from Boston, I worked on issues related to Central America. In the mid-1980s, a very infamous massacre took place in El Salvador at the Las Hojas Cooperative outside the town of Suchitoto. Now, that's saying a great deal since there were many massacres in El Salvador in the 1980s. Why was this one so special and so infamous? Because Las Hojas was one of the last communities where the remaining indigenous peoples of El Salvador lived and worked. And this massacre killed so many of their residents of all ages. Most of El Salvador's indigenous peoples were wiped out in 1932 during what was called La Gran Matanza, or the Great Slaughter, when the Army killed over 35,000 people, most of them indigenous, in the space of just a couple of weeks. So the military's massacre at Las Hojas was heinous not just from a human rights point of view, but how it amplified the historic slaughter of Native peoples in El Salvador and the hemisphere. I was also involved in Guatemala, and I accompanied indigenous leader Rigoberta Menchú on her first attempt to return to her country before the Civil War ended. We flew into Guatemala City together along with exiled labor lawyer Frank LaRue, and the Guatemalan security forces boarded the plane as soon as we landed and dragged Rigoberta and Frank off the plane into custody. Not a good situation. I spent the next 24 hours trying to find them and to get them back safely. Years later, Rigoberta would head a caravan of thousands of indigenous Mayans who had fled to southern Mexico during the Civil War, leading them back into Guatemala after the peace accords were signed. In the past few years, I have come to know some of the indigenous peoples and their chosen representatives in Colombia and Ecuador. Colombia has 87 indigenous peoples with an estimated population of around 1.4 million. I have met with some of their leaders in the steamy lowlands of Putumayo and in the cool high mountains of Popayan. I was privileged to spend an entire day in 2003 with Floro Tunubala, the first indigenous governor of Cauca, and to attend with him a meeting of many of Cauca's indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. I am well aware of the impact the continuing violence and conflict has had on so many of Colombia's indigenous peoples, driving some to the very brink of extinction. Indigenous peoples like Afro-Colombians make up a disproportionate number of Colombia's internally displaced. Government, corporate, and wealthy interests want to exploit their water, forest, and natural resources and take over their ancestral lands. And even though Colombia has some of the best laws protecting the rights of indigenous peoples, many indigenous communities are seeing their livelihoods, their culture, their very survival as a people under constant threat and attack. In some communities, young people are even committing suicide at alarming rates, seeing a future empty of hope, without room for them or their culture. I've met with members of the Cofan community in Durango in the northeastern Amazon region of Ecuador, whose survival is precarious because of decades of exploitation and contamination from oil production, much of it under the control or direction of U.S. companies such as Texaco, now owned by Chevron. Last year, the Commission held a hearing on how environmental degradation by U.S. and other corporations directly contributes to the destruction of indigenous economic, social, and cultural traditions, not to mention adversely affecting their health and their very ability to survive. As I expressed to the U.S. Embassy personnel in Quito, and as I stated in last year's hearing, I remain angry and deeply disturbed that the State Department doesn't view these types of violations of basic human rights to be worthy or legitimate enough to be included in our annual country reports. I also traveled up to the Ecuadorian border area north of Lago Agria, right on the San Miguel River, to meet with communities of Colombian refugees. Many of these refugees were indigenous peoples who had fled from Putumayo and Nariño, or areas of Colombia even further away. All they wanted was to return home, back to their ancestral homes, and have the right to live in peace. So on both a personal and on a professional level, I am very much looking forward to hearing the testimony of our U.S. government, NGO, and indigenous witnesses. And before I introduce the panel, I want to acknowledge my colleague, the Honorable Joseph Gao from Louisiana, for a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin, I just want to introduce to you a group of students from New Orleans. If you all don't mind, just raise your hands. They are up here visiting the Hill for several days, and obviously in the post-Katrina environment of New Orleans, they themselves have experienced what it means to have basic human and civil rights being addressed. So I'm pretty sure that this will be a learning experience for them. But in regards to the issue of human rights for the indigenous people of Latin America, when I was in the Society of Jesus from 1990 to 1996, I had the great opportunity of working in Mexico and working with the indigenous people in Chiapas. And I was very much concerned with many of their issues then, and I am still very much concerned with the issues that they have to face now. And I hope that through these hearings we can better understand some of the problems that they are facing, and hopefully how we as a nation can help address those issues. So with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Well, I thank my colleague for yielding. I want to welcome the students as well, and you're here for a very interesting and important hearing, and we're privileged to have you. In the interest of time, I'm not going to enunciate the entire biographies of our first distinguished panel, but I want to say for the record that this is, and I think for the first time, so many government officials have asked to testify at the same hearing, so I really appreciate that. So I'm very pleased that we have representatives from State, USAID, and the Human Rights Bureau. And they are Janet Ballantyne, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID. Kevin Whitaker, the Director for Andean Affairs at the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the State Department. And Joe Cassidy, the Director of Global and Multilateral Affairs in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, also at the State Department. We are honored that you are here, and why don't we begin with Administrator Ballantyne, and we welcome you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman of the Commission, members, it's an honor to present this testimony to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission.
I don't think your mic is on, or is it?
Or I'm not speaking. Is this better?
It's better. Okay, you got it.
My own interest in indigenous peoples of the Americas stems back 32 years, when my husband and I were privileged to find a very small, very injured young man, about 18 months old, and were privileged to be able to adopt him in Urubamba in the Sacred Valley of Peru. He's now 33 years old. He works for the United States government and remains very, very much committed to the indigenous values of the place that he came from, and reminds us every day how important it is to maintain those contacts. I welcome the opportunity to present how the United States Agency for International Development is committed to addressing the challenges faced by indigenous people throughout Latin America. In particular, given the focus of the second panel of today's commission meetings, I'm pleased to share with you some of our ongoing and emerging projects in Peru, Colombia, and Panama. We have quite a bit of literature that we're leaving on the table for those who are interested in looking at the larger picture of what we're doing throughout the region. I'd like to begin by sharing USAID's perspective and program directions on a regional basis. Throughout Latin America and the Caribbean region, we recognize and support the significant and historic advances made in guaranteeing Afro-descendant and indigenous rights. The increasingly strong governance role that indigenous people have assumed and the growing number of indigenous leaders, both in government and civil society organizations. The growing presence and activity of representative indigenous organizations across the region is a harbinger, we think, of strengthened democratic processes as indigenous people elect their leaders to represent their needs and their interests. USAID respects and supports these many indigenous organizations and their leaders as they represent important opportunities for free and open dialogue, empowerment, capacity building, and transparent governance. Most importantly, these organizations and the new generation of Afro-descendant and indigenous leaders taking mantle across Latin America and the Caribbean represent new opportunities for us to work with indigenous people, to extend their rights to develop, determine, and administer social and economic development programs. All of USAID's offices design programs through extensive consultation with indigenous peoples as part of the all-of-government approach in each country where our missions operate, ensuring that our indigenous-focused programs are in line with State Department policies as governed by the Chiefs of Mission. Incorporating Afro-descendant and indigenous issues in a holistic approach within our development assistance has required USAID to strengthen both its own institutional capacity and programming methods. For example, in a very decentralized agency, we rely heavily on the extensive experience of our local staff throughout our overseas missions, many of whom are indigenous and many of whom have worked with indigenous people across development sectors for years. USAID hiring practices and staff training increasingly focus on indigenous and social inclusion issues. Many programs disaggregate their program indicators by ethnicity so we can track how many indigenous people benefit from USAID funding and training. We strongly and actively exercise our responsibility within Title 13 of the International Financial Institutions Act to review multilateral assistance programs and address any potential adverse impact on indigenous people. Through our agency-wide requirement to analyze and address gender issues, many USAID programs focus on the particular needs and rights of indigenous women. By integrating indigenous languages and contact into education curricula, agency programs strengthen indigenous peoples within a cross-sector development approach in support of their language and educational rights. To further exemplify, I'd like to briefly highlight some of our programs in Peru, Colombia, and Panama. Our mission in Peru has a new leadership and training program for Afro-Peruvian and indigenous internships to increase professional and educational opportunities. This holistic and forward-looking approach complements USAID's on-the-ground projects by fostering the next generation of leaders. The mission also recently instituted new project design procedures that require an analysis of potential impact on indigenous peoples for all development activities. These two new practices exemplify the ways in which the USAID missions across the region are institutionalizing approaches that support the economic development rights of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples and that improve the impact of USAID programs. USAID and implementing partners are building the capacity of indigenous groups in sensitive ecosystems to generate sustainable livelihoods and equip them with business management skills